Always glad to have with us on Tuesdays, Dr. Gary Ostrower from Alfred University. Good morning, Dr. Ostrower.
Good morning to you, Brian. How are you doing?
Doing well, and yourself?
Well, I can't complain. Academic year is ending. I had my last classes just yesterday, so I can look forward to grading scores of final examinations.
Do you ever teach summer schools, Dr. Ostrower?
I don't. I did years ago, but I've taken advantage of the fact that we have summers to do our own research, and that's what I've been doing.
Sure thing. Well, Dr. Ostrower, lots of things to cover today. As far as Washington news goes, President Trump says he does not want Mueller to testify. What do you make of that?
Well, I'd like to know why the president doesn't want him to testify. What is he hiding? What is he afraid of? I guess it's maybe the same thing he's afraid of, or he didn't want to testify himself with the committee. And so he asked the committee if he could offer written responses, which, of course, tend to be much, much more safe. They're vetted initially by his lawyers and so forth. I think the president has plenty to worry about, and I think he has plenty to hide. And I think if people read the Mueller report, particularly the section that deals with obstruction of justice, they're going to find that the president's obstructed justice. So while the Mueller report may not, claim that it's an indictable crime, and that's because a president is not indictable according to the Department of Justice, nevertheless, I don't think there's any question whatsoever that he has, he did commit a crime. And I might add, by the way, that just within the past 24 or 48 hours, in the neighborhood of 400 former prosecutors of the federal government have said, indeed, the president is, he did obstruct justice, and that is a felony. So that, all the good conservatives out there are arguing the case for law and order. When it comes to law and the president of the United States, I don't hear them really stepping up to the plate. But in any case, the public, I don't think, is terribly interested in this any longer, and the president will ride it out, and so we'll have an election in 2020. There's certainly not going to be any serious effort at impeachment, and there won't be because the Senate unquestionably will not convict the president of a crime.
Dr. Ostrower, do you think, when you see politics over a long period of time, as you certainly have, you notice that political parties engage in retribution, and wondering, do you think that there could be any payback for the way that former President Bill Clinton was treated by the Republicans and by Newt Gingrich? Do you think that any of the investigation into Trump could have to do with that?
I don't think so, but I really don't think that's the case at all. I do think, however, that the Republican effort to impeach Bill Clinton, and there was, of course, a trial, and of course he was not convicted. But I think that in a funny way, the public saw that as political. Trying to impeach someone for a sexual crime. I mean, I suppose in a technical sense, the issue was that he committed perjury. In respect to the issue of sex. But it seemed trivial in a way, and I think that Clinton winds up more popular after the conviction than he was before the conviction. So in that sense, I think it tended to rebound against the Republicans. And
do you see that as a perjury trap, asking Clinton questions about extramarital affairs, and then when he lies, going after him for perjury?
I don't see it as a trap. I think he should have simply, answered honestly, as difficult as it might have been. Just as I think that President Trump should have appeared before the investigation. He should have testified. There's no perjury trap. If he committed perjury, then he commits perjury. But I do think that the Democrats should worry about, if they do go the impeachment route, that it may turn against them, just as I do believe it turned against the Republicans back in the year 2000. So, is there a political element to all of this? Of course. Impeachment is a political, not a strictly legal, but it's a political process. On the other hand, there are elements. There are times when, in fact, the process, I think, is very, very justified. And in the case of President Trump, who I think has, clearly obstructed justice, and that's a lot more serious than the kind of thing that Clinton was accused of. I think we better take that very seriously.
Talking to Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, you mentioned in an email yesterday that you'd like to spend some time talking about foreign policy today.
Well, I don't want to say too much about it, other than, one might ask a simple question, and that is, what is Trump's foreign policy? And you find that it's very, very kind of zig and zag in the sense that it's not very consistent. At one point, he threatens the North Koreans. At another point, he says that, he loves the North Korean leader. At some points, he's, suggesting that we may take military action against Iran. At other points, he seems to back away from that. It's not very clear as to what his foreign policy is, and I think it's because it really is very ill thought out. With the Chinese, he's now threatening again more tariffs against Chinese goods, and that may be as early as this Friday. To a certain extent, he's threatening the Chinese that if they don't come around, because needless to say, their economic policy, their tariff policy against the United States, and not just against the U.S., but against foreign goods generally, has really been quite unfair. And certainly, I think the Chinese have been involved in a lot of intellectual espionage against American goods, American-made goods, and goods made again from other countries as well. So I think the Chinese have a lot to answer for, but the way in which Trump has been kind of blowing hot and cold on the whole tariff issue, leaves me a little bit uncertain as to exactly where he is. If there's any single thread of consistency to Trump's foreign policy, I think it has a lot to do with domestic politics more than it does with foreign politics. He wants to satisfy his base here, and so, for instance, he cooperates with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, because I think the Republican right, the conservative right in this country, is very, very pro-Israel, not just American Jews, but American evangelicals generally. So, I think that, ultimately, I think historians are going to have a field day trying to figure out exactly what his foreign policy consists of. And, Brian, I do want to mention one other thing, and not about foreign policy. There was a really interesting article, I thought, in the current issue of the Atlantic magazine, and it was based on a question that they posed. And the question is, what is the greatest act of courage? In a way, what they're really asking is, what's heroism? Who do we define as heroes and who do we not? And so I want to kind of pose that question to you as you look out over the world today, and not just today, but even going back in history. Who do you find to be, the great heroes in history?
You're asking me, Dr. Ostrower.
Why not? And that's what we professors are supposed to do to our students.
All right, political heroes. I would say President Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy were a couple of the great political leaders of the 20th century. Okay.
The question that the Atlantic posed was a little bit different from the way in which I just described it. The question they posed is, what is the greatest act of courage? And let me offer you a couple of responses that readers provided to that question, or maybe not readers, but people that they question. One was Harriet Tubman, who 13 times during the slave period ventured down into the South to lead slaves out of slavery, knowing full well that if she was captured, she would certainly would have been incarcerated, and in all probability would have been executed back during that period. Another reader suggested that the signers of the American Declaration of Independence, who pledged their lives, and I mean this in a very literal sense, and they say this in the Declaration itself, they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the cause of independence. And they did. Many of them lost their fortunes. Some of them died as a result of this They knew certainly if the British had won the revolution that they would have been hung. I think that, we underestimate, as we, look back in history, we underestimate exactly what they did. There was another reader who said it was that guy in Tiananmen Square back in 1989, and some of our older listeners will probably remember this. We call him the Tank Man. He was a citizen who stood in front of a column of tanks that was rumbling down in Beijing in 1989 to protest, if you will, Chinese policy, Chinese Communist governmental policy back in there in that period. It took a lot of courage to do that, and it also took a good deal of courage for the driver in the very first tank to stop that tank and not run over this fellow, because I'm sure he suffered. I'm sure that he was subject to political retribution. But I have a friend, a professor who teaches at Alfred University. His name is Larry Greil. He teaches sociology, just recently retired from teaching sociology. And when he responds to this kind of a question, he says the greatest act of courage was by a fellow named Lenny Slotkin. And, of course, we all say, who in the world was Lenny Slotkin? So let me tell you who Lenny Slotkin was. Back in 1982, an Air Florida flight, it was called Air Florida Flight number 90. It was heading from Washington, D.C.'s National Airport down to Fort Lauderdale, was unfortunately not sufficiently de-iced in the middle of the winter. It took off, a good deal of ice coating on the wings, and as a result, the plane was unable to gain sufficient altitude, wound up losing altitude, headed toward the 14th Street Bridge over the Potomac River, struck the bridge, and then plunged into the Potomac. The Potomac was ice-covered at that time. Much of it was ice-covered. Eventually, 90 of about 97 passengers would die. But about 6 or 7 of those passengers survived. They got out of the plane. And in one instance, a woman simply had not been able to secure her life vest. And a driver who was watching this on the George Washington Parkway, passing the Potomac at that point, saw what was happening. He stopped his car, and he just dove into this freezing Potomac River at the risk of his own life, and he saved that woman's life. That kind of thing is pretty remarkable. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that just this past week, there was a shooting at the University of North Carolina I believe it was at Charlotte. And a young man, charged the gunman. He tackled him, and this young fellow was killed. I think he died just the day before yesterday. There's pretty remarkable stories of courage. And I think that, all too often in the rush of things, we just kind of forget that people are willing to quite literally put their own lives on the line in order to help other individuals.
Very interesting talking with Dr. Gary Ostrower, Alfred University history professor this morning. Going to take a quick break, and we'll come back and talk some history with Dr. Ostrower. Stay with us.
Selecting a nursing home for a loved one isn't easy until you've discovered Hornell Gardens Nursing and Rehabilitation. Hornell Gardens delivers the highest level of care, compassion, and commitment with amenities and activities that will enrich body, mind, and spirit. It's a place that's close to home. Stop in for a tour of Hornell Gardens, located at 434 Monroe Avenue in Hornell, or to learn more, call 585-222-CARE or visit hurlbutcare.com.
Checking in with meteorologist Rob Carolyn, who's pointing out that the sunshine is gone.
That's right. The clouds are here. Mother Nature's continuing to kick our rear, Brian. Boy, it'd be nice if we could keep like sunny days 3, 4, 5 in a row, but just not in this pattern. Got a cold front right now. Cloud stretch from Maine back across New York State through Michigan, all the way down into Kansas and Texas this morning. Looks like we'll be dealing with clouds throughout the day, and not only will we see the cloudiness, Brian, eventually some showers going to head our way. Right now they're stretched out from the Adirondacks right along the south shoreline of Lake Ontario to just north of Buffalo, but that line should sink southward as the day goes on. We'll get into a few showers, may hear a few rumbles of thunder. Temperatures today only up to about 60. Sunrise this morning 5:57. It sets tonight at 8:17. Now, we're going to be cloudy tonight, and the rain will move south of the region. Nighttime lows will be around 40. Tomorrow it should get better. High pressure will build in from Ontario. Will turn partly sunny. We should be 55 to 60. Clouds to return tomorrow night. Warm front headed our way. Showers will develop 40 to 45. Showers continue Thursday 60 to 65. We'll have more rain on Friday, Brian.
Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower, Alfred University professor of history. Dr. Ostrower, you asked me who my political heroes would be. I told you John and Robert Kennedy. Were you surprised I did not say Millard Fillmore?
Yeah, not very many people remember Millard Fillmore. I guess if you live in Buffalo, you do. You know, there's a Millard Fillmore school, and I think there may have been a Millard Fillmore hospital. But no, Millard Fillmore does not sit at the top of the pyramid of American presidents.
Why is that, Dr. Ostrower?
Well, for two reasons. He wasn't elected president. He became president as vice president when the president, Zachary Taylor, died back in the year 1850. But secondly, he was very, very, in some ways, although he was a Northerner, he was very sympathetic to slavery at a time when slavery was becoming more and more unpopular in the North. And consequently, he certainly did not distinguish himself in respect to what becomes the most important moral issue in the United States during the next decade, during the 1850s, the situation that leads up to the Civil War. But while one might criticize Millard Fillmore on that basis, the men who followed him, a fellow by the name of Franklin Pierce, who is a Democrat from the state of New Hampshire, and then another Democrat by the name of James Buchanan from Pennsylvania, were in some ways even less, they were worse, so to speak. I mean, these guys were really quite pro-slavery, and they would not have been elected by Democrats in the South had they not been pro-slavery. So, we tend to generalize that Northerners were, of course, anti-slavery, that Southerners were pro-slavery, but there was a lot of sentiment in the North that was, if not pro-slavery per se, that was not anti-slavery either. Many Northerners just kind of shrugged their shoulders at the whole thing. They just weren't terribly concerned about this. And I think that attitude, too, tended to make the war more likely because in the final analysis, presidents like Buchanan never took the kind of action, the decisive action, that would have said this is unacceptable and then, try to work out some kind of a situation that would lead to the gradual emancipation of slaves. So when the time came, it wasn't going to be a gradual emancipation. It was going to be through civil war. And, of course, I think that people in our area of the state, here in the southern tier of New York, tended to be more anti-slavery than many, many other Americans. It's interesting, for instance, that when the Civil War began, every single male member of the Alfred University class of 1861, every single male member joined the Union Army, and that was not untypical in this area.
That's a very interesting answer to my joking question about Millard Fillmore, who's always kind of scoffed and pushed aside. Didn't know much about him, Gary. This day in history, Dien Bien Phu. Yeah,
that's an interesting point. Dien Bien Phu was one of the most important battles, military battles, of the entire 20th century. So I know we don't have too much time, so I'll give you a real quick background. The French had colonized Vietnam back during the 1870s, and they remained in charge of Vietnam until the Second World War. The Japanese took it over during the Second World War when the French were defeated by the Germans. But at the end of the war, the French came back to Vietnam, and the last thing in the world they wanted to do was to surrender their colonies, to give up their colonies, because many French believed that you can't be a great power unless you're also a colonial power. Well, by 1945 and 1946, nationalism in the Third World, nationalism certainly in Vietnam, was becoming more and more popular. And Ho Chi Minh, who was the Vietnamese nationalist leader, he was a communist, but he was also a nationalist. And in 1946, he proclaimed Vietnamese independence. And I might add, by the way, that in his Declaration of Independence, he took some of the very same wording from the American Declaration of Independence, having to do with the fact that every man has the right to, the natural right to life and to liberty and to the pursuit of happiness. Be it as it may, the French got bogged down in Vietnam over the next 8 years, just as the Americans were bogged down in Vietnam during the 1960s. And in 1954, there was a final battle at a little place, a tiny, tiny little village called Dien Bien Phu, which is in the northwest section of Vietnam. The French believed that they could hold that. They had, of course, firepower. They had some air support. They simply did not believe that the Vietnamese could defeat a conventional French army. But the Vietnamese mobilized 40,000 soldiers. They took the high ground because the Dien Bien Phu was down in the valley. The French had about 15 or 20,000 men at that base, and the Vietnamese simply pounded that base for about 2 months. The French eventually had to shrink. They lost, much of the territory that they had controlled. And on this day in history, on May 7th of 1954, the French finally surrendered. And when they surrendered at Dien Bien Phu, it was the end of French colonialism. It was really the end of their position in Southeast Asia altogether. Well, because the French left, the Americans, again, on the basis of an anti-communist crusade, this is still the McCarthy period, the Americans essentially took their place, and by 1960, we were involved in that Vietnam War, and of course, we remained there until finally the last American soldiers left in defeat in the year 1973.
Gary, I'm going to take just a little bit of extra time here. There was an interesting article I stumbled onto on a website called theamericanconservative.com. And it criticizes President Nixon's TV speech, asking America to get into the Cambodian situation, and it said, take Nixon's words at face value. The real mission of the troops entering Cambodia was to avert the collapse of civilization itself. And the article is called "When Nixon Told Us Invading Cambodia Would Save Civilization." And the article goes on, most of this was nonsense. By putting a big hurt on the NVA, the invasion of Cambodia might buy a bit more time for the AVRN to prepare itself to fight without the assistance of U.S. ground troops. Overall, the Cambodia campaign proved irrelevant to the war's ultimate outcome. Your take on that?
Well, I think it's exactly right. Nixon, essentially, Nixon had claimed, beginning in 1969, that the U.S. was going to de-escalate. In other words, sooner or later we would simply leave Vietnam, which was, by 1969, clearly it had become, in a sense, an unwinnable war. Some people are going to claim that that's not true, that it was winnable, but I think that most historians agree that it was an unwinnable war. So Nixon kind of took account of reality and began to remove American troops. However, in May of 1970, he then expanded the war into Cambodia. And an awful lot of Americans said, something doesn't really make sense here. Something's not computing. Because if you're going to, withdraw from Vietnam, then you shouldn't be expanding the war, in this case, into a neighboring country. And so it led to a huge amount of how shall I put it? Protests, I guess, especially on American campuses. The draft was still intact. At 400 different campuses, including Alfred University, right here in Allegheny County, students went on strike. At Alfred University in May of 1970, not only did students go on strike, they took over the administration building. Final examinations were canceled, so that students had the grade, whatever grade they had on May 1st, that became the grades that they received at the end of the year. It was a chaotic period, and I think that ultimately it weakened Nixon as president. He wanted, I think for political reasons, but also for military reasons. He had authorized this invasion of Cambodia. It didn't work out, and I think that the article that you're talking about is exactly right by saying, in the final analysis, that invasion of Cambodia, they called it an incursion back then because they didn't want to use the word invasion, but that so-called incursion of Cambodia did not in any way affect the long-term fortunes of the war. If anything, it speeded up the degree to which the American public had tired of the war.
Dr. Ostrower, I got to leave it there. As always, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I hope that our little history lesson has taken hold out there.
Thank you so much, Gary.
You're welcome. Bye-bye now.